So good afternoon and welcome. My name's Tom Lee Doan and I'm the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs for the libraries. And I'm reading from a script because I just got this today, so you'll have to forgive me. So my preparation isn't all that great. We're pleased that you could join us today to recognize our current and former Library Scholars Grant recipients. On behalf of the Dean of Libraries, Jim Mullins, who's not here today, we welcome you to the 2016 Library Scholars Grant Recognition Program. The Library Scholars Grant Program was established in 1985, which is phenomenal, with a 50th anniversary gift from the class of 1935. And this year, the class of 1935 marks their 81st anniversary. As we acknowledge and hear from grant recipients, let's keep the class of 1935 in mind and thank them for their generous gift, which allows Purdue researchers to access rare archival materials all over the world in order to further their research. In just a few moments, we will recognize the 2016 recipients and hear how this opportunity furthered the research of Michael Johnston, who is the Associate Professor of English at Purdue University in West Lafayette. As a side note today, remarks and presentations will be videotaped and may be viewed in the library's ePubs repository. I would first like to take a moment to acknowledge the group of faculty responsible for reviewing the proposals and determining the grant recipients. This year, the selection committee was chaired by John Fritsch, Associate Professor of Library Science, Reference and Instruction Librarian for Purdue Libraries. Another selection committee member was John Pierre Herubal, Professor of Philosophy, Anthropology, Archaeology, Science and Culture, Jewish Studies, Medieval Studies Liaison at Purdue University Libraries. Catherine Dawson, Associate Professor of Art History, Department of Art and Design, College of Liberal Arts, Purdue University. Jane Yatsila, Associate Professor of Health and Life Sciences, Purdue University Libraries. And Melissa Remus, I hope I'm saying that right, Associate Dean, College of Liberal Arts, Purdue University. This year, the Library Scholars Grant was able to award 5 faculty members to assist in their research. I would like to take the time to recognize this year's recipients. The first one is Brett Crawford, Assistant Professor in the Department of Technology, Leadership, and Innovation. He was awarded $4,000 to travel to Montana State University to conduct archival research using the Trout and Salmonoid Special Collection. The research aims to explore how environmental associations have contributed to the shifting identity of anglers, moving away from the harvesters of trout and salmon populations and towards stewards of cold water fisheries. Crawford plans to focus on photographs and unpublished manuscripts that detail early thought on river conservation and catch and release philosophies. The intended dissemination of the research is twofold. First, organizations and individuals commonly use images to portray human impacts on the natural environment. We know far less about what we would learn about the changing identities of people if we turned the camera around and tracked shifts in identifying over time. This archive includes a large number of photographs that will deepen our understanding of early 20th century anglers' identities and relationships with rivers. Second, Crawford has built out a large data set detailing the emergence and expansion of environmental associations, such as Trout Unlimited and special regulations intended to manage trout and salmon populations throughout the U.S. cold water fisheries. However, the archive at Montana State University includes a number of unpublished manuscripts written by the fathers of catch and release fishing that will further develop this research by capturing the origins of river conservation. The second recipient is Marlo David, an associate professor in the Department of English and the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program, who was awarded $4,600 to conduct archival research in Los Angeles and New York City, using several special research collections to begin work on a book manuscript tentatively entitled Experimental Aesthetics: Recovering the Art and Life of Bill Gunn. Experimental aesthetics involves developing a literary and artistic bibliography of African American filmmakers. Playwright and actor Bill Gunn, who wrote and directed 6 films, wrote 11 plays, 1 novel, and performed as an actor throughout the influential U.S. Black Arts movement in 1965 through 1975. The Black Arts Movement marked a major shift in 20th century African American literary and artistic production that grew out of the social and political aims of the Black Power movement. Until recently, most of Gunn's works, plural, had fallen into obscurity, and to date there is no full-length critical manuscript dedicated to his life and films, plays, and novel. In experimental aesthetics, David seeks to recover the lost works of Gunn, as well as produce a detailed biography of his life. In particular, she is interested in discovering how the explicit political aims of the BAM, Black, sorry, movement, yes, may have created tensions for an artist like Gunn, who operated outside of those ordained aesthetics. Gunn's experimental work, especially his unflinching confrontation with sexuality and Black identity, exemplify these tensions and therefore require further inquiry. David will use the Literary Scholars Grant to take 2 week-long exploratory trips to visit archives and collections in New York City and in Los Angeles in order to locate, read, make copies of relevant materials related to Gunn's work as a playwright and filmmaker, as well as to locate papers of his many friends and associates. The next is Charlene Ellsby, Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Indiana University, Purdue University in Fort Wayne. She was awarded $5,000 to travel to the Husserl archives in Belgium to examine the original manuscripts of Edmund Husserl, in particular those that provided the foundation for the text Phenomenography of Internal Time Consciousness. Ellsby's research will focus on the concept of time in early phenomenography, how it appears in consciousness, and how it is constituted by consciousness. An examination of the phenomenological concept of time follows naturally from her previous work on the concept of aesthetic genesis in phenomenology, which examines how a robust human consciousness arises from more basic perceptions. From this research, she will produce a monograph proposal tentatively titled The Origins of Time in Consciousness and Consciousness of Time. The Library Scholars Grant will allow for 3 weeks to examine the Husserl manuscript and how they were edited by assistant Edith Stein and Martin Heidegger. His work on the concept of time has undergone significant modifications from the manuscripts, which are collected under the name of Time Constitution as Formal Constitution and housed in the Central Repository of the Archives in Leuven. The next is Rebecca Klein Peshava, an associate professor in the Department of History, was awarded $5,000 to conduct archival research in Hungary. Her current book project, with the working title Across the Iron Curtain, Jewish Displacement, Dispersion, and Contact, 1945 to 1960, examines the mutual efforts of Hungarian, Slavic, Czech Jews remaining inside of post-war Hungary and Czechoslovakia, and abroad to remain in contact with each other and the implications of their efforts for Jewish state relations in the consolidating new global order. This study is organized around points of contact between Jewish survivors within their new post-war global dispersion, the relevant materials related to religion, national minorities and ethnic problems, refugees, and escapees crucial for completing her research for this project, are uniquely held in collections of the Open Society Archives in Budapest, Hungary. The Open Society of Archives is one of the world's largest repositories of Cold War, Radio Free Europe, and samizdat, I don't know how to say that, holdings, especially known for its exclusive collections relating to the post-war political, social, and economic life of the Cold War era Eastern Bloc. The Library Scholars Grant will fund travel to Budapest for 4 weeks of research in the OSA collections on materials concerning contact between Hungarian, Slovak, Czech Jews in post-war displacement and dispersion as individuals, family and friends, institutions, communal bodies, and international Jewish organizations across an increasingly fortified border. Klein Peshava first received a Library Scholars Grant in 2013, which allowed her to conduct archival research at the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research Archives in New York City. Sylvia Mitchell, assistant professor of early modern European history, was awarded $5,000 to conduct archival research in Spain for an article-length project titled Anglo-Spanish Relations During the Regency of Queen Mariana of Austria, 1665 to 1675. It focuses on the changing nature of Spain's diplomatic relations with England under Queen Mariana's leadership, the Spanish Queen's close collaboration with King Charles II, who returned to power in 1660 after his father's Charles I's execution and the fall of the Cromwell regime, resulted in commercial and military alliances with pan-European and transatlantic consequences. While marking an unprecedented level of close collaboration justified by Spanish theologians as necessary for the good of Christendom, very little, if anything, has been published on this important topic. The Library Scholars Grant will help fund travel and 6 weeks of research to the National Historical Archive in Madrid, the General Archive de Simonicus in Valladolid, thank you, and the National Archive of Sesión Nobleza in Toledo. Mitchell will study Mariana's instruction to and correspondence with her diplomats in London. She will also consult with special series of Spain's Council of State focused on Anglo-Spanish relations. In a previous Library Scholars Grant project in 2014, Mitchell investigated Queen Mariana's foreign policy from broad European perspectives. Please join me in congratulating all of the 2016 grant recipients. And I'm sorry I butchered that. So we look forward to hearing more about your research and how the Library Scholars Grant was able to assist at next year's award presentation. Now I would like to introduce today's presenter and one of the 2014 grant recipients, Dr. Michael Johnston, Associate Professor of English, Purdue University, West Lafayette, who will share his research and travels. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Johnston.
Is this ready to go? Excellent. Thank you very much. I want to start by thanking the Purdue University Libraries in the class of 1935 who generously supported the research trip that I'm going to share with you about today. Thanks also to Robert Freeman, the librarian for English, who wrote for me in support of this grant. I should say that I received one a few years back as part of my first book project. This is part of a second book project, but the Library Scholars Grant, I think in 2011, it was really instrumental in the work I was doing on my first book. So I'm hoping that this one bears similar fruit. I should also add then that this is kind of a one-year delayed presentation because I received this grant and did research in the summer of 2014, but then I was on sabbatical in England doing further research in 2015 when I would have normally presented, so I'm presenting a year late. Okay, so courtesy of the Library Scholars Grant, I spent June of 2014 in London and Cambridge looking at manuscripts from 14th and 15th century England. This research was part of my second book project, tentatively entitled The Reading Nation in the Age of Chaucer, hence the title of my talk today. This project is by now well underway, thanks in large part to the work I was able to undertake in the summer of 2014. So first I'll give you a very brief overview of my project, and then I'll walk you through some of the images of the manuscripts that I took while doing this research, so that you can see the sort of thing I was investigating, courtesy of the library support. So this project looks at literary texts from England in the later Middle Ages. I'm looking at manuscripts, that is, of course, books copied out by hand, from the 14th and 15th centuries. Printing was developed at the end of this period. Gutenberg printed his famous Bible in 1453 or 54, and the first book was printed in England by William Caxton in 1476. But I'm not looking at print because print was still, throughout the 15th century, very much a minority affair. If you wanted a piece of literature, the primary recourse was to get someone to copy it out by hand for you. It wasn't probably until the late 16th century when printing became the kind of first recourse for access to a text. So So in this project, I'm trying to examine every surviving manuscript of 4 Middle English literary texts. The first of these is The Vision of Piers Plowman, which is an allegory that was written in the 1360s, 70s, and 80s in several versions. But it's a poem, a long poem, in which the author has a series of dreams about the corruption of his society and ultimately the destruction of his society. It's a really sort of satirical take on late 14th century England. This poem is contemporary with Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. It survives in almost as many manuscripts. It survives in 54 manuscripts. The second and third poems are short didactic works by John Lydgate, who was a Benedictine monk in 15th century England. If scholars know of him today, they think of him as a sort of pale imitator of Chaucer. And then, so the first of the 2 poems by Lydgate that I'm doing is called The Dietary. And it instructs its reader in the proper way to moderate food intake so that one can live a life of moderation, sort of you are what you eat. And the second of these poems is Stans puer ad mensum, which is the Latin title, English poem, The Boy Standing at the Table. It's a courtesy text instructing readers how to act around their social betters. Now, both of these texts sound completely dreadful to modern ears, I understand, but they were quite popular. Together, these 2 short poems, both are around 100 lines. Together, they survive in 77 manuscripts. So it's a pretty high rate of survival. It was a rather popular poem. And the final text is The Prick of Conscience, which is a poem of over 9,000 lines that attempts to, as the title of the poem says, it attempts to prick the reader's conscience. That is, as kind of goading you to think about the pains of hell and the joys of heaven, to convict you to sort of live a more moral life. This was the most popular poem, most popular verse text in Middle English. It survives in roughly 117 manuscripts. Okay, so my argument here, I start with a really simple statement. And I think most medievalists who have worked with manuscripts in any sense would agree with this, that every manuscript is different. You lay any 2 manuscripts next to each other, even 2 manuscripts of the same text, even 2 manuscripts by the same scribe, and there are innumerable sorts of differences. The parchment might be different. The hand will change across the manuscript. Scribes sort of get tired and their script deteriorates. Initials will be decorated in varying patterns. Rubrication patterns will vary. Collation will vary across manuscripts. And I could keep coming up with examples. But the point is that manuscripts are sort of like snowflakes, that no 2 are alike. And this, in my project, I'm calling the morphology of the book. And that is, I'm taking this term from linguistics, but the language is made up of individual building blocks of meaning that combine together to create words. And in a similar way, I'm thinking of these different production decisions and different features of the manuscripts as the morphemes that are combining together to make words. So I thought what I would, and this is something that scholars haven't really wrestled with, is how manuscripts work. And how this sort of instability might be fundamental to understanding manuscript culture and how manuscripts work. So that's really where I'm coming in with my argument, trying to look at all of the copies of these 4 literary texts. So I think today I'm just going to focus on one of the texts, just to give us some focus here, and that's The Prick of Conscience, the last of the ones I talked about. Interestingly, this poem survives from every region of England. You can see this is a map of where, based on the scribal dialect, where we think the manuscripts were produced. And so you can see basically that each of those each of those boxes represents 1 manuscript. So you can see it. I mean, it was being copied out everywhere in England. Moreover, it survives in all sorts of copies, from the very deluxe, highly decorated codex to the very scruffy, unprepossessing miscellany. And it was owned by all sorts of people. We have evidence of nobility, rural gentry, urban merchants, etc. And interestingly, it inspired a stained glass window, a 15th century stained glass window in All Saints North Street Church in the city of York. This is very rare, actually. It's unheard of for a vernacular literary text to make its way into the fabric of a church like this. But you can actually see some of the text right there. That's a blow-up of one of that bit there. Okay, so the there's 2 main features of this corpus of manuscripts that I'm analyzing in this book and arguing are important. And the first of them is what I call their local production. And by this, I just mean that most manuscripts were produced, copied, in the same region where they were read. And this is part of my argument, is looking at these manuscripts. This is what has emerged. And how I tell this is when provenance evidence survives, and provenance, by provenance, manuscript scholars simply mean evidence of ownership and circulation of a book after its moment of production. So when provenance survives, it almost always accords with what we can tell about scribal dialect. So if the dialect, for example, points to Herefordshire, most often we find that that manuscript was actually owned in Herefordshire. So it's this, part of the argument is that there's a tight connection. People are looking to local scribes to make books for them. And this is something that, again, medievalists haven't quite realized. All the focus has been on London and this growing commercial book market in London, where Chaucer manuscripts were being produced, very high-end manuscripts. But I don't think, part of my argument is that that doesn't quite tell the whole story, because if you look at manuscripts like the Prick of Conscience, they seem to be made locally. And dialect is, is, at least I think, interesting, because by spelling patterns, medievalists can tell where a scribe was trained to write. And it's lost on us in present-day English, but it's as if someone from Indiana spelled things differently than someone from California and then someone from South Carolina. And you could look at, say, a letter and say, that's a Hoosier-trained person writing there. And that's sort of what we can do with Middle English because it's so dialectally stratified. Okay. So now to some images. So I'm going to talk about the localness, the local production and circulation of these. So the examples I'm giving here are where manuscripts were, where we can tell, where we know they were produced and where we know that matches where they lived. So the first one here is Cambridge, Gonville and Caius College manuscript 386. It contains just the Prick of Conscience. There you can see an image of one of the pages. Typical mid-15th century, what we call a secretary script. Its scribal dialect has been localized to the western part of Suffolk, where you see the star there. As it happens, in the back of the manuscript, there's a deed related to land in Mildenhall. Now, if you notice, here's the Prick of Conscience itself, copied out by a scribe from Suffolk. In the blank pages in the back, someone has copied a deed related to land in Mildenhall. You can see right there, whoops, wrong thing, of Mild in Hall, which is in the same part. It's in the west of Suffolk. So this later owner copied a deed related to his land, and he had a text that was copied in the same region. This next one is actually one that I think is kind of interesting evidence. It's from an earlier research trip because it's Wellesley College here in the States. But I wanted to put it in here because it kind of relates to some of these other ones. Here is the Prick of Conscience. The dialect has been localized to the north of England. In the back of this manuscript, there's an ex libris from Byland Abbey, which is a Cistercian monastery in the north of England. I actually can't show you that because you have to have ultraviolet light. It's been effaced. But further, and so that's in Yorkshire. It's in the north of England, like the dialect of the scribe. And then in 1534, we know this book still lived in England because there's another, these people doing drafts of materials in the back of their book. She dates it to 1534 there, and she names herself Cecilia Cook, wife of Robert Cook of Skeby, Skeibey, which is in the North Riding of Yorkshire. So this book was still staying locally. What do we have here? Yes. This is a British Library manuscript, Cotton Appendix 7. Kind of some funky things going on here. We have 3 scribes. You have a main scribe, the scribe on the left, and he writes in a very neat sort of practice book hand. And then he hands off to this scribe on the right, who is a much sloppier scribe. There's 3 scribes at play. There's this experienced scribe and these 2 sloppy scribes. And interestingly, the sloppy scribe is writing on recycled parchment. I think this, you can see how there's lines. It's been ruled for some kind of writing that's gone the other way, and they've sort of then decided to reuse the manuscript. But only the sloppy scribes use this sort of weird parchment. So there's something going on here. And then this is the first scribe again. This is the good scribe, scribe 1, sloppy scribe, scribe 2. This is later. This is sloppy scribe, scribe 3, handing back off to good scribe, scribe 1. And there are other features. The sloppy scribes they don't really know how to apply. There's a lot of rubrication on the first letters of lines. They don't know how to do it properly. They kind of gob the ink on. When you're there and looking at the manuscript, you can tell. Whereas this scribe knew how to apply red ink. So there's some weird sort of production things going on here. But what interests me in terms of dialect is that all three scribes have been localized to Lincolnshire. And then, so these three scribes, the good one and the two sloppy ones, all three can be localized to Lincolnshire. And then in the back, and I'm sorry, this is a little out of focus, but Iste Liber Constat, I think his name is sort of effaced there, but it says John Hutchinson de Braytoft Capellano. This book belongs to John Hutchinson of Braytoft, chaplain. Well, where is Braytoft? In Lincolnshire, where the three scribes are from. So this is a 16th century owner. Some priest owned this book in the 16th century. I'm going to try to figure out who he was. Haven't got that far yet. But he owned this book in the 16th century, and of course he's getting a book that was produced. Well, there's Lincoln, so that's the county of Lincolnshire there. So again, produced locally, circulated in the immediate vicinity of where it was produced. Canterbury Cathedral, unfortunately, wouldn't let me take pictures of the manuscripts, but there's a really cool manuscript there that has the Prick of Conscience, that has a dialect that's been localized to Wiltshire, which I have on the map here. And then in the back, again, this guy's he's put a draft of his will, and he asks that his body be buried in All Saints, North Morton, which is right there, just south of Oxford. Wiltshire is down here, so again, not very far. And he leaves money to the church at Salisbury, famous cathedral down there. So again, another book that was made by a scribe from Wiltshire and then owned by this guy in the 15th century. Didn't move very far in its life. And then the most interesting and final example of this feature that I want to talk about here is from another British Library manuscript, Harley 1731. What's really cool here is on the inside of the binding. It's been rebound by the British Library at some point, but they found this thing buried in the binding, and they pasted it to the modern binding so that scholars like myself could do something with it. So this is a Latin note that's pasted in the front of this book, and this is what it says. There's my transcription and just a translation. Let it be remembered that on July 5th, 1473, Richard Redd of Petersfield delivered to the Commission for the Diocese of Winchester 3 books. The first book was Secundo Folio Ye See of This. Don't know what that is. The second book was Secundo Folio Sancto Sicut. The third book was Secundo Folio and also How Merciful. So there's some commission that's investigating book ownership, maybe for heresy. No idea. Again, it's another thing I want to look into. I don't know of any scholarship on this particular commission. But this guy is said to have 3 books. And the Secundo Folio is a medieval library cataloging practice where you would record the first words on the second folio of a book, because that was a kind of unique identifier. Every book's going to have the same first words on the first folio if you're copying the same text, right? But then by the second folio, you'll get a separate, you'll get a unique set of lines that will help you say, that's that book. So they're recording the second folio readings. Now, if you look at the third one here, so this is the commission wants these 3 books. What does the third book have? Secundo Folio and also How Merciful. That's pasted inside the cover of Harley 1731, and you turn to the second folio of that, and there's the line, and also How Merciful. So this copy of the Prick of Conscience was the very book that this commission was after. Again, is it heresy? I have no idea, but it shows us that the Prick of Conscience was somehow being dragged before some sort of commission. Right, and this guy who owned this book is said to be de Petersfield, which I've put on the map there for you. And the scribal dialect has been localized to Wiltshire. Again, Wiltshire's over here by Winchester, so just a touch to the west of Petersfield. So in all of these cases that I've shown you, and many, many more that I just simply don't have time to talk about here, readers were looking to local scribes to make books for them. These provincial, remote origins for these scribes, I think, suggest that the scribes were probably working in isolation. I don't mean to say that everything that wasn't in London in the 14th or 15th century was some kind of cultural backwater. But if you take a look at the population of places like Winchester, Wiltshire, wherever this particular book was being made, or Lincoln, as we saw earlier, all these provincial locations, there's just going to be fewer people making books, fewer people to sort of learn from, to hone your trade in competition with, etc. And so I think we're going to find, what I argue that we do find with these provincial books, is more irregularities. There's a very famous study by two paleographers in England, Ian Doyle and Malcolm Parkes, who analyze London book production, and they talk about how regular these books are. Same number of lines to a page, same decoration scheme, et cetera, all the way down. And I think precisely, but that's because in London you had a lot of scribes working together, so there's a kind of uniformity that could develop. And my argument is that something quite different is happening here because of the sort of geographical isolation that I've identified with the sort of provenance dialect overlap. So the second feature, and I'm going to go quickly through this just in the interest of time, but the second feature is then this irregularity that we find in books. So the first example I have of this is Douay Abbey, manuscript 7, which is Douay was a recusant Catholic abbey on the continent after the Reformation, but then it was suppressed in the 19th century, and then when England legalized Catholicism again, the monastery came back. So it's now in the south of England, but they still retain their title here. So this is Douay Abbey manuscript 7. It's a tiny parchment manuscript, 175 by 113 millimeters. It's literally the size of a note card, sort of flipped up 90 degrees. Dates from the first half of the 15th century. The interesting thing here is that its scribe was content to use parchment scraps. There's really all kinds of weird things going on. I don't know if you can quite see this, and again, I'm sorry, this picture is a little out of focus, but that's the bottom of the parchment page. It's totally irregular, and this has all been modern, a backing put on it just to preserve it. And then later, he's got these are called pricking marks. This is what you did. You pricked the sides of the manuscript that then allowed you to rule things straight. But you would prick the entire thing. And just in the sort of middle 30 pages of this, there's random prick marks that just go down the middle of the page. And I think that this is another case of recycled parchment, right? Somebody was pricking a few lines, messed up a batch of 30 pages, said, screw it, put it aside. This guy said, well, I need some parchment, something like that. I don't know how else to explain it, because they're not functional for what he's writing there, right? They're left over from something else. And I don't have time to talk about this, but when you do the collation of the manuscript, looking at how the quires were put together, it also shows some sort of sporadic things. If in the Q&A you want to come back to this, I can sort of unpack the collational formula for you if you want. Another manuscript that I found really interesting, I took a day trip up to Leeds to look at Brotherton manuscript 500, which you see here. This is late 14th, early 15th century copy of the Prick of Conscience. The scribe of this manuscript is just clearly unpracticed. He doesn't know what he's doing because there's some interesting things. He has trouble left justifying his text. You can kind of see how it curves there, especially when you get down there. It's a strange thing. But then he seems to be making up the mise en page as he goes. And what I mean by this is where's my example? Yeah. There's bits of Latin. About 95% of the Prick of Conscience is in English, is Middle English, but there's chunks that are in Latin. And so here he said, okay, how am I going to signal the Latin? Usually scribes will put the Latin text in red or draw a box around it or something. And the scribe says, how am I going to do this in Latin? Or how am I going to signify the Latin? Here's Middle English, and here's where the Latin starts. Okay, so he divides. I'm going to put the first letter out farther into the left margin. Makes sense, except then he forgets, and he does both letters out in the right-hand margin. And then he forgets, and he starts doing the left-hand margin, and then he does like 6 out into the left-hand margin. And here he started writing, let's see, this is all Middle English, right? And this, right here, and this is all Latin, because it's Latin prose, you can see it goes out here. But then when he started back on Middle English, he just keeps it out in the left-hand margin. He forgets to kind of justify it back in. So there's examples of this that are going on throughout the manuscript that just, I think, show that a scribe like this just isn't practiced. These are the sorts of inconsistencies that I see happening, I think, as a result of kind of provincial locations of production. And again, the collational formula shows that he's kind of making things up as he goes. But again, we can talk. I won't bore you with this formula here, but we can talk about that if you're interested. Skipping on then. Yes, and here we have an Oxford manuscript, Rawlinson C35. It's again another irregular production. You can see the opening leaf there. He's left spaces for initials that he never executed, which isn't entirely unusual. Cost-saving measure. It costs money to get someone to come in and do fancied letters. But then we get, clearly he's reusing parchment that's heavily written on. Some of the other ones we saw were lightly written on. You can almost overlook it. Here it's been heavily written on, and he's still content to reuse it. And then here you see there's been a text underneath, which is a kind of late 14th century cursive script, but he's just left it there, and there's a kind of close-up of it. And then there's another text underneath this page. You can see down there, and I've zoomed in over there, that he's scraped off, but he's been content to leave, I think, which is a kind of earlier 14th century text. So he's got this sort of pastiche of text, yeah.
Are these on leather?
This one is probably parchment. I didn't note this, and when you have so many manuscripts, you forget. Parchment you can scrape, right? And usually if you scrape parchment, you can get a cleaner than that. It might be paper. And here's, it's a music manuscript in the gutter that you can still see very clearly. So he's got all these sources. And the very last example is, I think, the coolest thing I've seen so far. This is Oxford Trinity College, manuscript 16A. The guy just starts messing around with the mise-en-page. He lays blank, like spaces in the middle of lines with certain little virgules there, and then blank spaces, and then dots. I don't know if he's making this book for himself, so he can kind of make it substandard. I don't know. And then you can see he starts to say, oh, let's just spread words out so they take up the entire line again. And then he says, well, let's put some red virgules in there, and let's put touches of color on words all across the line. And then he gets to the word me at the bottom, and he just spells it M with, I don't know, 15 E's. Okay, that's not something I've ever seen before. He's clearly having fun. And he does the same thing with the word hell, H-E-L-L, and then a bunch of E's. And again, I don't know what to do with a text like this, but I find it endearing. And so I think that's a good place to stop. I think I'll leave off there and just close by saying that the work I was able to do here in London, Cambridge, and a few other libraries in the summer of 2014 was really essential to what I hope is the speedy completion of this book project. And I'm really grateful to the library and the class of 1935 for their support. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we have time for questions, is that right?
Yes.
Great. Oh, yeah, sorry, Marlo. Yeah.
Okay. So I was wondering about.
Oh, hold on. I think that you're supposed to speak into the microphone so that the camera for posterity.
Right. So they can. Okay. Great. So my question involves questions of literacy. I don't know much about the process of becoming a scribe in this era. So were they reading? I mean, are they literate in their dialect as well as Latin? Are they copying these things? Is that why there's such variation? What are the relationships there?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so they're certainly copying. That's the process. It's you would have someone wants a book, and you get an exemplar and you copy it, and you give them the copy, and you return the exemplar to its owner. As far as literacy, this is another huge unknown question. I mean, not the question of literacy in terms of who was able to read is a question that historians have been wrestling with for a while. And there's a huge discrepancy in terms of what people think in terms of rates of literacy. But I think that, in the 15th century, 25% literacy wouldn't be out of order as a percentage, especially in cities. Some people say upwards of 50% in London. But then how are these scribes learning to write? We literally know nothing. And so this is actually another part of the project, is a kind of an ethnography of writing training. Because there are institutions all over England that are, it's a documentary explosion in the 14th and 15th century. So all kinds of institutions, every single parish had to have scribes to keep records. Every landowner had to have scribes to keep records. So we know that they had people to draw on, and there's sporadic evidence that, for example, Oxford started having a quote-unquote business school developing where they were training people just in document production. But we just haven't quite gathered together the evidence. So that's going to be the kind of opening part of the book is, where were all these provincial scribes getting trained? Here are some, at least, hypotheses. So that's a kind of, I'm presenting on that this summer. I'm woefully behind in the reading I need to be doing to give that presentation, but that's what I'm sort of in the middle of thinking about right now. Yeah. Yeah, Robert.
Related to that, perhaps the boom in documentation has something to do with the availability of parchment, production of parchment, how, and of these of the manuscripts you looked at, how many were parchment and how many were paper?
Yeah. I don't have the actual breakdown of parchment versus paper. Let me take the first question. Availability of parchment. I have never heard it argued that there was a difficulty getting parchment, simply because, you know, go to England now and take the train through the countryside. All you see are sheep, right? And I mean, England was the wool-producing center of Europe in this period. So I don't think that the parchment production would have been a difficulty. Paper is interesting. I mean, I think just going on my gut of there's sort of 240 manuscripts for this project. I've probably now seen about 200 of them. Of those, maybe 30, 40% are on paper, somewhere in that range. Paper slowly starts to trickle in the late 14th century. And it came through the Middle East, became popular in Italy, I think as early as the 12th century, if I'm remembering the dates right. But it's really the 15th century, the end of the 15th century, when paper surpasses parchment as the most common medium across all books. And that's probably about right here. Paper supply is interesting, though, because there are no paper makers in England until 1496. All the paper is imported. So actually, there'd be more of a chance of a kind of difficulties of supply with paper than with parchment, because parchment, everyone's eating the sheep, everyone's shearing the sheep. Once you kill them, use their skin for writing too, right? So, yeah, Larry.
Wait.
Hold on, you got to get the microphone.
Thank you, Michael. This is fascinating. I'm wondering about an alternative explanation for the standard manuscript size, number of lines, etc. in London, versus the rural manuscripts, which seem to have all these distinctive or even unique characteristics.
Yeah.
I'm wondering whether there was some cultural differences. Maybe in London they valued standardization, or they were turning out so many manuscripts it was just easier. Whereas in rural settings, they might have taken pride, you know, we're in Lincolnshire and we do it this way, which is different from everybody else.
Yeah. I mean, if there were a sort of like, okay, that's how they do it in London, here's how we do it in Lincolnshire, I would assume then that you would see patterns, like certain geographical patterns emerge. Like, oh, in Lincolnshire you'll find, 38 lines to a leaf instead of the standard 42 in London. I'm just sort of making something up. And I've never seen that argument made. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not there, because most scholars haven't thought in kind of geographic terms about book production. So it's possible, but I don't see a lot of commonalities across these disparate, irregular manuscripts that would allow me to say there's a kind of style that would be different. So yeah, I mean, I'm trying to keep these other sort of explanations in mind, but I haven't found a kind of real way to explain it besides they were just kind of doing what they could off in isolation. But yeah.
Was there any formula sellers of these manuscripts would have used to price them for sale? Would have been like per page or some other measurement?
Yeah, I mean, the typical, so scribal labor is they're sort of separate elements, right? You have the scribe, and then you have the decorator, and you have the binder, and you can sort of access any of those steps for your book, but you could just have the book unbound and undecorated and just get it copied. So if we just focus on the scribes, it seems to be the practice that payment was by page, because you will find surviving in books scribes noting how many leaves they've copied down in the margin, and that clearly seems to be a formula for then say, okay, I'm 3 pence a page. I've done 27 pages. That's what you owe me, and they're always written in the margins, which are supposed to be trimmed if you get the book bound. So they don't survive very frequently. But there's enough of them that scholars have been able to identify. Yeah, it's by the page. Yeah.
I think I have a question, and you partially answered it. Perhaps there's several questions. One of which was, are you presuming then some of them you can attribute at least to later owners, if not the initial owners?
Mm-hmm.
Were these essentially contracted with scribes then? A wealthy individual says, I'd like a copy. And in particular, the one then where you have 3 scribes.
Yeah.
What's your guess about what's going on there? Because some of the scribes were not as good as the original scribe or something, and someone's paying for that, presumably. Yeah. And is it wealthy individuals or organizations, or who would have commissioned these?
Yeah. I can't get to the level of that fine-grained detail for a particular book to say this guy commissioned it from this scribe, because we just don't have the records of scribal commission, right? And I think most of the time there probably wasn't a contract, right? It was a sort of verbal sort of thing. But most of the owners would have been certainly, on the wealthiest sort of 10% of the population. What I've got right now is after spending this summer in 2014 and then my sabbatical in 2015 working with these manuscripts, I've got hundreds of pages of notes, much of which is about the names that are inscribed in the manuscripts. Now the next step is to go and look in the archives and try to narrow down who these people are. So I can't quite say much about them, but in my first book, I did this with a smaller group of manuscripts, and the people that you can see owning things are people who are wealthy. I mean, by social class, they're called the gentry, but they're kind of wealthy, the sort of lower end of the aristocracy. And I think there's a lot more of them than the nobility, so I think that's where you'll typically find owners of books. And again, if you think about that sloppy one, it could be that it just didn't jump out to people like it does to us today, as that's not what a book should look like. Like, we expect regularity, but we're used to books off the printing press. They might have had a higher degree of whatever you want to call it, sort of leniency for that. Alternatively, though, sometimes there's nothing to say that someone isn't making this book for him or herself. I mean, it could be that this guy, maybe he's a priest and he wants a copy, or maybe he's just a local landowner and he wants a copy, and he's like, I'll just do it myself. I'm able to write, and he has some servants in the house who spell him for a leaf or two. If we don't have immediate, like that one that has 16th century owner, there's a good 75 years or so between those two that we just absolutely can't account for because there are no other names there. Yeah.
And a question about the parchment rarity too. I mean, it must have at least been expensive if they're reusing it, obviously.
Yes, absolutely.
It. So
yeah,
it may have been available, but expensive, because otherwise, again, how could you explain somebody commissioning a text, a copying of a text, and saying, wait a minute, you're giving me a reused,
absolutely. In producing a book, scribal labor was the highest cost, and the second highest cost was the parchment. I'm not sure that there was ever a shortage, but expense would explain the reuse, right? If you've ruined a piece of parchment and you think, I don't want to reuse this in my book because someone's paying me good money for this, you might still stick it down there and say, I know someone who's making a cheaper book who would be willing to use this sort of second-rate parchment. Yeah, that happens quite frequently, actually. Yeah.
I understand the regionalism that's involved in the production of these works. What's really striking to me is, and I can understand the irregularity, so to speak, and as you say, the leniency or the tolerance for such production. What's really fascinating to me is also the little knowledge that I have about it is apparently there's a high tolerance for idiosyncrasies performed by the scribes themselves. Even in let's call it an upper tier production, would people purchasing these particular books have a high tolerance for somebody doodling, so to speak, or saying hell or what have you, or I should have gotten my ale somewhere else.
Yeah.
Something like that. Joking aside, there must have been a high tolerance for this kind of activity.
I think so. I mean, I ended with this hell example because it's so weird, and I've never seen anything like that. Because you're actually sort of messing with the words of the text as opposed to doing something sloppy. But the larger pattern that you're asking after, yeah, I do think that. I mean, I don't know what other evidence you would have than the fact that the books happen to be irregular. So that's the only way we could tell that they seem to have tolerated it. We don't have, people's diaries saying, "Oh, I saw John's book and it was much, less irregular than mine, and I wish I had his." Like that doesn't exist. I mean, the point of comparison would be high-end manuscripts, high-end illuminated manuscripts, which simply don't have these patterns of irregularity. So, but they tend to be not vernacular literary texts. They tend to be works that are in Latin or French. Has a much sort of higher cultural cachet. So I do think that there's a sense in which, it's vernacular, it's Middle English. It can be a little cheaper. Yeah, Larry.
How is parchment produced? They take leather and then they do something. They tan it. What do they do?
Yeah, I've never actually seen it done. I've only read about the process. But yeah, you take sheepskin or cow skin, and you stretch it and scrape the hair off of it, and then you dip it. You dip it in a lime solution first, which loosens the hair, and then you stretch it. And there's a special tool. I think it's called a lunella, because it's shaped like a moon. Luna is Latin for moon. Lunella would be little moon, and you use it to scrape the hair off of the parchment, and then you let it dry, and then you cut it into the right sizes.
Oh, okay.
Which is why you'll have often holes in the parchment, because an animal gets bit by an insect, it's got a little hole in its skin. You stretch it out and the hole gets bigger. There's another example. Someone was asking about the irregularity of parchment. I mean, that's pretty, even in high-end manuscripts, you'll have holes that people will write around, et cetera, because that's just, you're dealing with animal products. And you can actually, on a parchment manuscript, you can tell which side was the flesh side, the side facing the guts of the animal, and which side was the hair side. When you look at a parchment manuscript.
And did they have a preference to write on one side or the other?
Well, you would have written on both, right?
Oh,
because you're folding the page in the middle and then writing on both sides. But good manuscript producers did try to make hair side face hair side, because there's a slight difference in appearance. So when you open the book, you would want to see hair and hair, and then when you open the next page, you want to see flesh versus flesh. So there was some sort of mechanical sort of mathematics that they had to do to get it to line up that way.
Yeah. It's interesting, sheepskin to sheepskin. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, the scribes had to write around the scars sometimes.
Yes, right.
Little.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's the exact same thing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they preferred, because it was scrolls, it was written on one side, although they talk about scrolls written on two sides when there are curses, but they like to write on the hair side.
I see.
It was,
okay.
I don't know, tougher or more durable or something.
Right. So when it's not a bound codex, you have a choice. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, well, there are lots of. I mean, scrolls are very common in late medieval England too for record-keeping purposes, but they tend to write on both sides of the scroll. So, I don't know if they even thought about which hair or flesh, because they're going to flip it over and write on the other side anyhow.
Yeah. Economy. If no one else has a question, I have a. Oh, go. Standa, there you go.
I have two questions, and so the one is still back to the scribes.
Yep.
What were their background? Whether they were basically lay or clergy? Because it just seemed that you sort of mentioned both, but on the other hand, predominantly lay people.
Yeah. So most of the work that's been done in identifying scribes and figuring out who they are is based in London, because that's where a lot of the records are, and we just have more scribes there, and they're almost always lay. We do have some clerical scribes, but they're almost always lay. I mean, it's a mix, but again, of the scribes we've identified, I would say about 75% are lay. I mean, this is, if you're thinking about sort of, the Dark Ages with monks huddled over books, I mean, that really ceases being an applicable narrative after around 1100, which is when books sort of move out of the monasteries and into the wider world through universities, through the mendicant orders, the Dominican and Franciscan friars, and then you get a lay commercial market. So by the 15th century, nothing's really, very few books are made in monasteries anymore.
And the second one would be about the method itself. I can also imagine that at this point, several of these manuscripts would be already digitized. And I do understand why you would like to see them, but in case you wouldn't want to, no, you wouldn't need to see them, is there some kind of methodological difference? How you would approach and interpret the digital text you cannot actually see and the factual, physical you can touch?
Yes. Of all the manuscripts I'm looking at, again, there's I think 240, probably about 20 have been digitized. And I'm sure those in the library who've worked with DH things will realize that just something being digitized there's a huge range of quality, and some you can get really good, in close, and some you can't. But the truth is there's never, for what I'm after, just looking at the digital isn't enough. Often that saves me time because I can kind of flip through it before I go. But if I go back quickly to the collation, which is how the choirs are put together, which can tell you a lot. Somewhere back here, sorry. Yeah, here's an example. Where did I go past it? Yes. The first choir that's telling us was comprised of 8 folios. The second was comprised of 8. The fourth one was cut out. Third and fourth are 8. The fifth is a 10 with the 7th cut out. The 6th has only 4 leaves with the 4th one cut out, etc. You actually just can't tell that. You can't tell that from a digital copy. You have to actually sort of get down and look inside the binding, see where the binding threads are. There's all kinds of tricks you use to get at this. So that's just one thing of many that just looking at the image of the page won't let you access.
When do scribal guilds start appearing?
In England, 14th century. I'm sure it's probably 13th in Italy, where textual production is sort of, well, England's sort of 50 years behind the continent on just about every sort of trend. Yeah, so that would be my guess. I don't know about the rest of the continent, but certainly late 14th century. It's the same time you see this huge explosion in Middle English manuscript production. It's the same time you see people starting to organize scribal guilds. Yeah.
Getting back to that page where the scribe was having fun and he put words in vertical columns.
Yes.
The only other place I've seen that was last February, the first time I ever saw a Torah scroll in person.
Okay.
Couldn't touch. But it was a certain passage in Exodus where they're crossing the Sea of Reeds, okay, and this is while the Egyptians are chasing them.
Yeah.
And it's written in a very stylized way, and when you see a Torah scroll, that's how they did it. It's in 3 columns.
Okay.
Yet you read it across, and it's just the way you did it.
And so every Torah does that. Every Torah scroll would do
as
this.
far as I know. I'm not at all an expert. I saw my
Yeah.
first one last February, but they did have an expert who said that's how you do it. So I wonder, is there any analogy? Is there any other place where you've seen that in European scrolls that are?
Not in vernacular literary texts. Again, the one I showed up there, that guy he doesn't have some kind of higher spiritual purpose, I think, to what he's doing. He's just messing about. I'm sure that in religious texts, and these would be in Latin, that there are sort of ways of signaling things on the mise en page. I just simply don't know what those are. Yeah.
Okay. It was just a shot in the dark.
No, it's a great question. I would love to know.
So thank you very much, Dr.
Yeah,
Johnston.
thank you.
Appreciate it. So please welcome. Thank you. So this concludes today's presentation, and we hope to see everyone at the next year's awards presentations. Our recipients may be invited to serve on a future Library Scholars Grant Selection Committee, which is typically a 3-year appointment. Thank you, everyone, for coming today, and congratulations to the grant recipients.